Hello everyone and welcome to the video, and today we're going to be going over a Hota build for Barbarian. I do believe this is probably the best Hota build in the game. I've seen some other ones, I've seen a lot of variations of it, but as you can see here in this clip I'm showing you, I was able to hit a 4.2 million, and this is on an under-geared Barbarian that I literally just power leveled, and I have pretty much all codexes on my gear. A lot of the aspects that I would need I don't even have, and still with subpar gear and at level 74 I was able to hit a 4.2 million, so I can only imagine how much this build will go up to in terms of damage. I could definitely see it going well over 10 million. So with that out of the way, let's just get right into it. So the first thing we're going to look at is the gear. For the helmet, we obviously want cooldown, max life, armor, and max fury. And for the aspect, we have the one that gives you damage reduction for every bleeding enemy around you. You're going to have, basically everyone around you is going to be bleeding, so this is very, very important to have. For the chest piece, we have just a typical DR chest with maximum life, and it has disobedience. And for the gauntlets, the stats you're going to want are critical strike chance, hammer of the ancient ranks obviously, lucky hit chance, and strength. And we have the anemia aspect, which allows us to stun people that are bleeding. It's very good for the build because a lot of the damage comes from stun. You can also change out lucky hit for attack speed if you don't have a lucky hit chance gauntlet. Obviously, there's a lot of different variations of stats you can get on a lot of these pieces, but this is definitely, I feel like lucky hit's just a little bit better than attack speed. And the next thing we're going to be looking at is the pants of the build. Obviously, just temerity is probably going to be the best option. This gives you a barrier. It's really great for survivability. Not much to say about it. And then for the gloves, we have movement speed, strength, berserker duration, and fury cost reduction. You're definitely going to want fury cost reduction and movement speed, obviously. Those are like the most important things. And then the core skills have a 40% chance to extend the duration of your berserker. Very, very important. And then for our two-handed mace, we have vulnerable, crit, damage to stunned, and strength. Since we're going to primarily be damaging enemies that are stunned, having stun damage is very important on your two-handed weapons. And then for the aspect, we have the hammer of the ancient ones, obviously very necessary. And then for our amulet, we have CDR, fury cost reduction, movement speed, and ranks to heavy-handed. You could also do ranks to wallop or even ranks to all defensive stats. It really doesn't matter, but you definitely want fury cost reduction, ranks to something, and movement speed. Cooldown reduction is kind of important as well, but you don't necessarily need it. And we also have the retribution aspect on our amulet, and this is very important because you deal 60% extra damage to stunned enemies. This is awesome because, like I said before, all of our damage is coming from stunned enemies. And now we're going to be taking a look at the rings. The rings have hands down the most important aspects, especially this one. Whenever you cast a shout skill, its cooldown is reduced by 1.9 seconds per nearby enemy up to a maximum of 6 seconds. This is very, very good. And if you have CDR from your helmet and amulet mixed with this and some of the nodes that we're going to be getting in our Paragon tree, you're going to basically have 100% uptime for your shouts, which is very, very necessary for this build because all of your fury comes from having your shouts up constantly. And as for the actual affixes on this ring, it's vulnerable damage, max life, crit strike damage, and crit strike chance. You could swap out max life for resource generation. On my other ring, I have resource generation, but you could double up. You could do 2 resource generation rings and get a little bit more if you are struggling still with resource or fury generation. So now we're going to take a look at the next ring. And the next ring is very similar. It has the same affixes, except, like I said, it has the resource generation. But the aspect is your shout skills generate 4 fury per second while active. Since you're going to have 100% uptime and 3 shouts active, you are getting 12 fury per second, and this is where most of your fury is coming from. And this is why I said the 2 aspects on the rings are easily the most important parts of the build. You definitely need these to make this build work. So if you're not seeing the results you want, it's because you probably don't have these. And now we're going to be taking a look at the other two-handed weapon. For this, I have damage to stunned enemies, vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, and strength. It's pretty much the same thing as your two-handed mace. And for the aspect, we have each point of fury generated while at maximum fury increases your next core skill up to 60%. You could swap this one out actually with the aspect that's on your amulet, because then you'd get 80% damage to stunned enemies. And for our one-handed weapons, we have vulnerable damage, critical strike damage, damage to stunned enemies, and core skill damage. We have core skill instead of strength on our one-handed, just because core skill is going to give us a little bit more damage. Obviously, it has diminishing returns, so we don't want to just stack core skill damage on our two-handed as well, because then we'd be getting too much of it. But the 29% extra core skill damage is going to be much more beneficial for us than the however much percentage that you get from stacking strength in, I think you get like a little bit over 100 for one-handed weapons in terms of strength, so it's definitely not as good as the 29%, but with diminishing returns, you don't want to just go all out for core skill damage. And as for the aspect on our first one, we have whenever you deal direct damage while berserking, inflict 30% of your base damage dealt as bleeding over 5 seconds. This is nice. It kind of ties everything together because you're not going to be getting a whole lot of bleed from the build in general. But with this, you're basically always going to be berserking, so the damage you do is always going to inflict bleeding, which is going to help keep people stunned. It's going to help with your damage reduction, and it's just very important that you have this one as well. And then as for the second aspect, we have Ground Stomp creates an earthquake, damaging enemies, blah, blah, blah. So obviously we're using Ground Stomp instead of Leap, and this is for the stun, and this just helps give a little bit more damage. And while you're standing in the earthquake, you also deal 50% extra damage. This is a lot of damage. This is a big increase, so that's why we have this one. And now we're going to take a look at the skills. We have Rallying Cry at R1, War Cry at R2, Challenging Shout at 3. We have Wrath of the Berserker at R4, and then for our left click, we have Hammer of the Ancients, and right click is Ground Stomp. For our expertise, we have the one-handed sword expertise. This helps a lot with our Fury generation. If you're not having problems with Fury generation, then you can go with the one-handed mace, because this gives us extra damage to stunned enemies, which is pretty much all we're ever going to be attacking. So I'm just going to go over the skill tree real quick with you guys. I'm not actually going to talk about it, you guys can just copy it, but I am going to talk about how you're actually going to be using this build. When it is fully online, you are basically going to have 100% shout uptime, and like I said before, this is very, very, very important, because this is how you're going to be generating all of your fury. Now, if you are at a point like I was in that first clip, I am at a point where I don't generate enough fury. I don't have good shout uptime because I don't have one of the necessary aspects that I have on my ring. And if you're like this, then you're going to probably need to take out one of your shouts and put in a basic attack. This build is very, very heavily reliant on having 100% shout uptime, because it's how you're generating all of your fury. So if you can't have your shouts up at all times, you're not going to be generating enough fury, and you're probably going to need a basic. As for a basic skill to use, Lunging Strike is probably the best. As you can see, I have that actually in the build. This is going to help you in your earlier game. So this build does kind of struggle a little bit earlier game, but once you get those two aspects I was telling you guys about on the ring, you'll probably be fine. And without those two aspects, you're not going to be able to run every single skill you want to run, because you'll have to substitute out one for a basic skill. But in terms of actually using your abilities and engaging, I think the best way of using this build would be pressing your 1, 2, 4, and then you press 3, and the 3 taunts everybody, it pulls them towards you, and that's when you right click and you hit your Ground Stomp, and then you do your Hammer of the Ancients, and you just basically spam it until everyone's dead. This is going to be your setup basically. It's not very hard. I kind of put them in order of how you're going to be using them. You could swap the 4 and the 3, but I like having my ult at 4. I don't know, I'm just a little bit weird with that, but they are kind of in order. You just go 1, 2, 4, 3, and then right click, left click. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward, not a whole lot of setup, not very hard to do. But now we're going to be taking a look at the Paragon tree. I'm just going to kind of run you guys through it because there's obviously a lot of nodes. Just copy it down pretty much. So for the basic one, the starter one, we have the Territorial Glyph. This just gives us more damage to close enemies. Pretty beneficial because we're basically always close to enemies. And then for our second Paragon board, we have the Carnage board, and in the Glyph socket, we have Exploit. Exploit is very important because this is basically the only way we're going to be able to get people vulnerable. It is kind of a problem if you're fighting bosses, but there's ways around that. And then we have Blood Rage as our next board, and for the Glyph, we have the Martial Glyph. This is very important for keeping our shouts at 100% uptime. And then our next board, we have the Bonebreaker one, and for the Glyph we're using for this one, it is Wrath. This one is great for Fury generation because skills that critically strike generate 3 Fury. Next board we have is the Decimator board, and for the Glyph for this one, we have Undaunted, and this gives us a lot of bonus damage whenever we're fortified, and on this build, we're basically always fortified. So, this Paragon board gives tons of damage. I definitely think this is probably the best route you can go with a Paragon board, and this is probably the point in most builds where I see people mess up. But that's pretty much it for today's video. If you guys enjoyed this build, make sure to drop a like on the video. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time.